also what was going on is that the never-ending deaths, especially, or not maybe especially, but really intensely in terms of people within the movement dying, that pointed to our inability to stop the dying. Despite our incredible victories. I've never been involved in activism that had so many victories. I mean, bam, 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 we just got access to institutions and we started having all these incredible victories, and people were dying all around us, despite the victories, okay? So there was this, and many of us, you know, and this is a really interesting question, and maybe we had some naivete, but we really thought that we were going to be able to stop the crisis, and we were going to be able to save people's lives. It's a wonderful quality to have that, to actually have that belief, but it was increasingly appearing unlikely. Okay, we were not really going to be able to save people's lives, our comrades' lives. So we were overwhelmed by this incredible knowledge of the breadth and depth of the crisis, as well as we were starting to feel politically inefficacious, and therefore a kind of despair took hold. Okay. The affective landscape within ACT UP was also changed by that point. Okay, so in particular, there were largely unstated and unacknowledged feelings of betrayal, non-recognition, and mistrust beginning to circulate in the movement by this point. Okay, so I'm going to say something about that, but before doing that, I want to just say what's really interesting here is that when we think about political conflicts within movements, we tend to think of them as like strategic, ideological, political kinds of conflicts. They're that, but they're usually, rarely if ever, only that. The affective dimensions of internal conflicts, their emotional undercurrents, that's what gives them their punch. And with the term emotional undercurrent, with the idea of an undercurrent, I mean to suggest that feelings operating in a movement's internal conflicts are often unarticulated. They're often unacknowledged, very submerged, but they nevertheless have a force to them, a direction to them, an intensity to them, and an insistence that affects the texture, the tonality, the intensity, the velocity, indeed, the very content and character of those conflicts. Okay, so we can't really understand conflicts within movements without thinking about that affective, the emotional undercurrents. Okay, so amidst this growing despair and desperation, movement participants, we all were trying to figure out what was wrong. Why weren't we able to stop this epidemic? And we sometimes turned our attentions inwards towards one another, towards ourselves, to think what's going on. Why can't we succeed here? So here, let me just give you one example out of many. This is an anonymous missive to ACT UP New York's internal newsletter called Tita, Tell It to ACT UP. Quote, "Stop trying to save the world. ACT UP will not stop racism, sexism, the Contras, or save the whales. Concentrate our few resources on AIDS. That's what the A in ACT UP stands for. The most important task of ACT UP is to pressure agencies to expedite drug testing. Every other issue is a distant second to this." Okay, so this and multiple other statements and similar kinds of statements from the other side, this brings me to this issue of non-recognition. So this was a period when women in ACT UP were undertaking a campaign to try and pressure the Centers for Disease Control to change the definition of AIDS. And the definition of AIDS, it really mattered because depending on how the disease was, or the syndrome was defined, that determined who was eligible for presumptive disability benefits, who was admitted into experimental drug trials, and who would therefore live longer. Okay. So it was a really crucial, it was a life and death campaign changing the definition, which we eventually won. Now the whales in that anonymous missive are apocryphal. It was a rhetorical device to suggest that some ACT UP participants' concerns about racism and sexism were dangerously steering the movement off track. Okay. So the political concerns of women in the movement were prompting resistance among a number of gay men in the movement, and their resistance felt to us like non-recognition. Where women in the movement, lesbians, once had felt solidarity and respect from the men, many of us now felt that they viewed our sense of urgency as unimportant, as marginal to the real struggle, which was getting them drugs. We felt dissed. Where we once had felt integral to and at home in the movement, we now felt a sense of non-belonging and non-recognition. And at the same time, the resistance that we encountered indicated that many of the men, especially those with HIV, felt anxiety and fear that ACT UP was losing the fight against AIDS, and therefore that they were potentially going to die. It also revealed a related sense of betrayal by their ostensible comrades in the movement. So returning to Sotomayor's statement, which I read earlier, what stands out is precisely his sense of having been betrayed by ACT UP, and in fact by people claiming to be his friends, okay? He invoked the category of a person with AIDS. He indicated that he felt abandoned by ACT UP members who did not have AIDS, and who had manipulated ACT UP so that AIDS was no longer at the top of the agenda, people who had forsaken him and other people with AIDS, just as larger society had done. Okay, so people on both sides of the conflicts began to feel that they and their concerns were being disregarded. They began to feel abandoned, betrayed, not recognized, and so on. And the stakes here were very high. Now, in a context where experiences of non-recognition and a sense of betrayal were emerging, and where a growing despair provoked scrutiny of one another's motives and actions, identity categories took on a new salience. And people on both sides began to view identities in a very fixed and essentialized manner, where, for example, you have certain physical attributes, that translates into an identity, and that then translates into supposedly a predictable set of identifications and disidentifications, and therefore a predictable set of politics. So before we had all been queer AIDS activists, we had been fighting the AIDS crisis side by side. Now there were suspicions about which people with AIDS were you really fighting for. Were you fighting for me and people like me? Did you truly care about all people with AIDS or not? Okay, so we became increasingly desperate as the never-ending deaths kept going, and a kind of competitive scarcity mentality took hold. And the two sides were in a really vicious dynamic, insofar as each side's concerns about various people with AIDS and commitments to those people were read by the other side as evidence of betrayal. Okay. Concerns about women and people of color with AIDS, for example, came to be seen as a lack of concern about white gay men with AIDS. Concerns that the organization had become too focused on women and people of color came to be seen as an abandonment of those people in favor of white gay men. Okay, now, and these feelings were largely unacknowledged, they were wholly unaddressed. Such sentiments of betrayal and non-recognition and consequent mistrust and anger, all of that fundamentally shaped these political conflicts, creating a monumental impasse of bad feelings that made it very, very difficult for us to address one another across a growing chasm. Moralizing took hold, okay, and that's of course a really widely available register. All you have to do is look at the political discourse more generally, whether from the right or the left. People shame one another, they guilt trip one another, it's kind of our idiom. And ACT UP, all sides in the debate engaged in that idiom, okay, of kind of wagging our fingers and shaming one another. So, and it kind of, I'm not going to go into too much of that, but it kind of went like this. You're privileged and selfish, you have narrow, racist, sexist politics, you're selling out other people with AIDS, that's one side. And I participated in all of this. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that I don't understand where it comes from. And from the other side was you're opportunistic, politically correct, uncaring, and betraying gay men with AIDS. Okay, so those were both sides engaged in a kind of moralism, which made it really, really hard to address one another. Okay, so with that, and of course that kind of stuff happens in other left activist formations all the time, so that's why this case I think is quite useful.